Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today it is time to talk about something other than WoW. I've been playing Albion Online for a lot over the past week and it's currently in its summer alpha test. And today I'm going to give you just like a rundown of kind of what the crack is with the game. Now this video is a part of a promotion with Sandbox Interactive, which is pretty much the same that I did back in February with their winter alpha. Though worry not, I've got complete editorial control and I am quite literally free to say anything I want. If you're interested, there's a link in the description, and of course I do recommend watching gameplay and coming to your own conclusions about stuff. And I was going to do just the raw commentated gameplay version of this video, but there's so much to go to that I think it makes a lot of sense just to give you a single edited video that just explains what the hell's going on. So, Albion is a open world sandbox MMORPG, which is giving me some vibes of RuneScape 2007. If you've watched the channel, you'll know that's something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. Albeit they are going a lot more in terms of sort of guild versus guild warfare, player-made buildings, having your own personal island, and various other things like that. So, I'm just going to start off at really the base of the game, which is crafting, and you're going to do a lot of crafting. The very first thing you actually do in the game is you start off naked. You gotta, whack some wood, whack some rocks, make yourself some gear. And a lot of that is really just a matter of clicking on a resource node or a dead creature that you've killed, waiting for a little bar to go up, and then boom, you've just, skinned your rabbit and got some stuff. Similar enough to most MMOs. After that's done, you can then take all of your resources to a crafting building and turn those resources into items. So initially you'll want to make yourself a set of tools like a pick, an axe, various things like that, and then just some basic leather armor to make sure that you don't get mauled by a small kitten. And that's pretty much how the crafting of Albion works. There is quite a hefty progression to it, but at the very base level, that's really what the crack is. Basically, in terms of the in-game items and things like that, it's all split into tiers, with tier 1 being your very basic stuff, and the later tiers being a bit more advanced. So for an example, to make a tier 2 item, you need tier 2 resources, and the same would go for the other tiers. This means that the rough progression is, you gather loads of tier 1 resources, then you craft your tier 1 tools, then you use your tier 1 tools to gather some tier 2 resources, and then you use those tier 2 resources to make some tier 2 gear, and so on and so forth. Now, to actually be able to equip that stuff, you will need to do some stuff to progress your character's skill set, but I'll get onto that in a bit. A big part of this is that getting also the higher tier resources involves heading into the more dangerous parts of the world and doing a little bit more exploring, and I'll go over how the world fully works in a bit. Next, though, now that we sort of roughly know how the crafting stuff is, let's talk about combat. So combat in Albion is, actually it's really quite simple, though the tuning and death penalty does make it quite punishing and, if I'm honest, pretty tense when you mess up. So clicking on an enemy just engages combat and gets you auto-attacking, and you've then got some abilities, and they do depend on what you're wearing, and this is one of the parts of Albion that I actually do kind of like. The way it works is that when you craft a bit of gear, that bit of gear will have spell slots, and usually you sort of have an active slot and a passive slot, though armor does get a little bit more varied as you go through the game. So for an example, you could craft a sword with an attack that taunts enemies, or you could craft a sword with an attack that doesn't taunt enemies, i.e. a DPS sword and a tank sword. You could craft armor, which is about doing maybe additional damage, buffing your strength, or maybe armor that's all about surviving more stuff. Another example is you could maybe choose like a DPS-focused sword attack, or maybe one that doesn't interrupt. So there's a good bit of customization there in terms of what you actually wear. And what you wear depends very much what type of character you are. You can be like a warrior, a mage, or a ranger, really covering the sort of main archetypes. Now this combat system means that it starts off super simple. Literally you only have a few buttons to press at the start of the thing. But overall, it does get a little bit more complex as you progress, but even at the more complex levels, it's still quite simple, and look, this is a multi-platform game, including sort of tablets and PC, and I suppose that makes sense, and I don't really mind that aspect of the combat that much. I enjoyed the RuneScape stuff for what it was, because I think the combat worked within it being just a wider part of the world. You've still got all your bases covered, though, in terms of AoE attacks that need to be dodged, enemies having interruptible nukes, having, shields, healing spells, and things like that. And I suppose the depth comes with working sort of with other players and using the variety of the toolkits of, the tanks, the healers, the DPSs, and then the different variations of each to sort of solve problems. I think one of the reasons why it does work, though, is the tuning of the damage in the world. If you pull multiple mobs, you put yourself at risk of death. And I'll cover dungeons later on, but they seem to be tuned in such a way that light coordination is absolutely needed for the simple dungeons, and quite a bit of coordination for the larger ones. Overall, the skill cap of the combat system, though, it's not massive. But this is a game that's more about progression and more about sort of socializing and stuff with other people, so I think some people will like that and some people won't. But let's just get back to the idea of things being punishing and talk about death. When you die, all of your items take a durability hit if you're in a kind of safe zone, and what's different about Albion in comparison to WoW, though, is that your items can be fully destroyed, and also the repair costs are quite large. And I like how this means that death actually matters in the game, and I think it's really key to it being a sandbox. Now, that's how death works if you are in a sort of safe zone. It's entirely possible to die in an unsafe zone, a PvP zone, so to speak, and, well, things are a lot more serious there. And honestly, it's a bit like when you would go PKing in the wild back in RuneScape. If someone dies, they drop the stuff that they're carrying, and you can pick it up. Now, if, you have the idea of maybe someone stealing your Hellfire Citadel gear, that would sound pretty harsh, but it's not really that bad in Albion because you craft a lot of gear, and while it's not completely disposable, it's quite common. And also a part of the larger guild versus guild warfare seems to involve the economics end of things. It's a bit like in, say, EVE Online, where I get the vibe where if you don't want to partake in combat, then you can be in the farming sort of wing of your guild, or you could be the part of your guild that is all about supplying the troops with weapons and armor. Plus, when you kill other people, you pick up their armor, so honestly, it kind of does balance out. Now, I've already mentioned some stuff about how zones are safe and some others aren't safe, so let's just cover the world. Now, the world of Albion is pretty much split into these, square zones that are all in a big grid, and you can see the grid on this, actually, I think, rather aesthetically pleasing map. And then going from zone to zone is really simple. There's, gates at the corners of all of those zones, and you just sort of hop across them. Now, each zone is quite different, though, because you get different quality materials in them, and you also get different difficulties of enemies. This all goes way back to what I mentioned in crafting, where things are split into tiers. So a noobish zone might have tier 1 or 2 materials and tier 1 or 2 enemies, and then a harder zone will have, higher tier resources, more challenging enemies. I'm not fully progressed, but it would seem like the more high tier, areas do contain more interesting enemies with more stuff. The first dungeon that I visited was nestled away in this pretty cool, it was like this undead castle area, and those mobs were pretty challenging to the point where we did wipe, and a few people actually lost bits of gear, so that's something we had to replace and fix up pretty quickly afterwards. Now, inside each zone, you normally have a road, which is sort of around the outskirts, which is nice for traveling about the place, but they do a really clever thing in terms of world design. When you go into a more difficult part of an area, it usually involves sort of walking up a hill or down a hill. And that might seem really simple, and maybe a bit too simplistic, but it's a really nice way of denoting that, okay, now I'm going into a dangerous area. And it sort of does that in a way that doesn't involve a big UI element or anything like that, which is pretty cool. Now, zones also contain dungeons and hellgates. Dungeons are either solo or for 3 to 5 players, though they're non-instant, so they can actually be a part of the open world, and if a dungeon's in a PvP zone, then other players can come in and try to, shank up your dungeon, which I guess could be sort of weird, and maybe could lead to some really memorable moments where you kill the other people who are coming in, you steal all their gear, you kill the final boss, and you have a pretty good day. Mobs in the dungeons are a lot stronger, though. They're basically elites. They've got more abilities and stuff like that, and they do drop quite a bit more silver, which is one of the main resources in terms of just actual money. You can also get bits of gear and rare resources from the mobs, too. Now, there's a system that I haven't done yet called the Hellgates, and they're a little bit like dungeons, but they're kind of like dungeons on crack. You find these gatekeeper, boss mob people, and they're designed to essentially take a group of people to kill. I think it's 5 players, and then killing them gives you access to a Hellgate dungeon. They're way harder than normal ones, or so I gather anyway. They are actually above my gear level, but you get in there, and there's really good rewards inside. Now, another gatekeeper boss will spawn in the world, and another group of players can go into your Hellgate dungeon, and this is kind of supposed to lead to PvP combat and stuff like that. It seems like a cool system. I haven't got to try it out yet, so I can't really speak to whether it actually works or not, and it's a new thing in this particular alpha test of the game. Now, there's also raids, though honestly they're not a big massive thing like they are in World of Warcraft. They're basically just large dungeons with high HP, highly tuned mobs that have got quite a lot of AoE and group threat mechanics, meant for 10 to 12 players. The closest I've got to one of them is outside, because we got shredded and the group fell to pieces. which, well, you know what, it was fine because it's nice when the world actually kills you, I suppose. Now, this is also a decent time to mention the faction system. When you start off, you can find like 5 different factions of just like NPC dudes in Albion, and they're based around the basic skills. So you've got like the army people, the gathering people, the crafting people, and so on. I've got the most experience with the combat, like army people, and basically you get a certain amount of missions each day from an NPC, and the difficulty depends on the zone that you're in. Anyway, completing the missions gives you some silver, which is, again, one of your main just currencies, and it also gives you these little token thingies, and you can exchange those tokens in for bits of gear, which are, I think, roughly on par with Tier 4, so it's an alternate way to gear up outside of crafting, something that I do kind of like. Now, when I visited the higher tier zones in a large group, I ended up finding a bunch of other factions, and they were tasking me with killing like really high-end mobs, which I just couldn't even touch. So it seems like some of the high-end faction stuff is definitely based around group play, and that stuff was also generally in the active like PvP zones, so it does seem like they're encouraging a big risk-reward element into heading out to the dangerous parts of the world. And what they seem to want is people to be heading out in sort of groups with their guild, like venturing outside of their guild island, and really going into the world and trying to, like, get stuff. I suppose, anyway, it's certainly the gameplay that I have found myself doing over the last few days. Now, speaking of PvP stuff, well, their main emphasis seems to be guild versus guild. Most of the higher-end PvP zones have got, like, multiple empty towns in them, and those towns can actually be captured by guilds. It actually sounds a bit like some of the nullsec stuff that goes on in EVE, but of course way more simple. You can build things in those towns, and that basically means a hardcore PvP guild could actually be based like out of somewhere like in the world where combat's a really sort of constant part of just surviving and maintaining themselves. And if they balance their systems right, this could be pretty cool because people can attack your castle, take it over, and it's not your castle anymore. So definitely an interesting perspective to the game, and I suppose something that would maybe help build community and stuff like that, which could be really awesome, so there's definitely potential there. Now, as well as the regular zones, you've also got cities, and cities are pretty cool, and they start off actually quite bare. They're just basically full of empty plots of land, and those plots of land can be purchased by players. Purchasing land, though, is a bit of a commitment because it costs silver coins and also like a daily upkeep cost to keep that land actually being in your control. I assume the upkeep is there so that, like, people don't just, like, buy the land, then quit the game, and, you know, then, like, an entire city is just, like, a ghost town. But basically, when you buy a plot of land, you can build things on them, and there's loads of different buildings. Building stuff costs resources, and once you build the base building, you've got to upgrade it to the various other tiers as well. And there's loads of different kinds of buildings. Most of them, though, are all about crafting, so if I mine a whole bunch of ore, then I'm going to want that ore smelted down into bars. So to do that, I'm going to need a smelting building. And after I've got my bars, I would then need to find a building of the appropriate armor type that I would like to make. So for an example, a warrior's armor building, i.e. basically a blacksmith. Then if I wanted to, say, smelt tier 2 metal bars to make, like, better armor, then I would also need, like, a tier 2 or higher smelting building. The same goes for making armor as well. And I think what's nice about this system is it creates a bit of a dependence between players, which is, I think, something that definitely works great with that guild system, which I'll go into a bit more detail on in a bit. Now, there are some other kinds of buildings. You've got farming stuff, which honestly, I'm just not that interested in, but you can plant crops in your farm. You can also raise livestock, like horses, which you can then turn into mounts and sell to other players, which I guess is kind of cool, but I'm not really into the farming aspect of things in most games. The buildings themselves, though, like, they do incur costs. Making any tier 3 or above items at a building does cost silver coins. Tier 1 and 2 are free for the sake of making the initial progression a bit smoother, which is definitely a good move, because if you needed silver to get the very basic stuff, then honestly the early game would just be way too much of a grind, and I don't think it would be nearly as much fun as it really can be. So each building has also got a bit of a tax on it that's based on the region of the world that it's in, but on top of that, players can also charge a tax on the use of their buildings. Now, since the land that the buildings are placed on sort of costs money and upkeep, and the building requires upkeep as well, when players set tax, it's kind of like them running their own business in the game. So if you're a big landowner in a city, and you've got a few, like, really important, like, well-leveled up buildings, then you're actually going to make good money off taxing other people to use your stuff, which I think I like the idea of. It makes things feel a bit more vibrant and player-owned, which is cool. Now, I mentioned guilds back there. Guilds are similar enough to other MMOs, but they're particularly nice in Albion or just any other sandbox game because, well, they are sandbox. Guilds can purchase their own islands, which is something that I thought was particularly nifty. Now on the guild island, there's loads of plots of land, and guild members can work together to build up their island to have like loads of useful buildings and things like that. You can also purchase your own personal island and build things on that as well. And the islands are instanced, and you can just travel to them by talking to an NPC, and you get ported over there for free. Now, speaking of travel, you can have mounts in the game. There's two different kinds. There's oxes and horses. So horses are faster, but the ox can actually carry more stuff. This is kind of important since logistics do matter. You've got like a total carry weight, and the banks aren't shared between all locations, which sort of means you will have a bit of a home base, and you'll need to lug stuff around the place if you really want to move that home base. Now, I have talked a lot about what you can do so far, but I haven't really talked about the progression and the actual skill system. I kind of reckon it'd be best to mention that once you have a rough idea of what's going on with the game. Now, at first glance, it probably looks really daunting, but it's kind of intuitive. You've got 5 paths that branch out. You've got your combat, your crafting, your gathering, your farming, and your refining. And it's all kind of natural. Crafting stuff will progress your crafting, killing stuff will progress your combat, and so on. However, it does get a bit grindy, something that I'll talk about later in my feedback and sort of critique part of the video, but let's just use an example. If I wanted to craft a level 2 sword, I would need to use level 2 ore. If I wanted to mine level 2 ore, I would need to have the appropriate skill to equip the required pickaxe. The skill that would allow me to use that pickaxe would require me to mine loads of the previous tier of ore. And once I have my level 2 bars of steel, I'll then need the right skills to craft them into a level 2 weapon. And to unlock the skill to craft a level 2 or like a 3 weapon, I'll have to craft loads of weapons from the previous tier. I think if they balance the numbers right, it can feel like a good progression, and it does sort of feel intuitive and natural. It's just that I think that it could definitely be tuned a little bit better. Now, as you can imagine, all of this sort of really adds up as you get to those higher tiers. As a quick example, the ability actually to craft a tier 3 sword required me to craft something like 20 tier 2 swords. Now, in the actual game, chances are you'll be able to sell those to other players on the auction house, so I can actually see it feeling a little bit better on the live game. Now, there's also a salvage building where you can basically salvage the stuff you craft back into raw materials and some silver coins, which definitely helped out. But still, getting the tier 4 stuff does feel like a little bit of a grind. And on top of having the tier 4 stuff, you've also got different kinds of rarity. Now, this is beyond the scope of how long I actually have to work in this video, but for an example, you could mine a rare version of the tier 4 ore, which would maybe allow you to make a tier 4 claymore that was level 2, with like a level on top of the tier. Now, this ore is harder to find in the world, it requires a better pickaxe and a little bit more danger as well. Now, the one thing that I'm very happy about so far is that it doesn't seem like, because this is a free-to-play game, it doesn't seem like there is any way to like skill up faster. So while you could probably buy loads of the premium currency, which is gold, which you can then transfer into silver, you could buy a lot of that and then buy loads of items, but it seems like you will always have to put in the raw gameplay to be able to equip those items, which is something that's definitely good. I think that's the right way to go about things. So I think overall with the skill up system, I like the base gameplay involved, but I think it's maybe 30% too slow. That being said, being able to craft a new tier of gear actually felt very rewarding. It felt like an achievement because of this balancing. So I suppose it's a bit of a hard balance to really strike that well. What I do like, though, is that you progress at doing a thing by actually doing that thing. If I want to get better at chopping wood, well, I go out into the world and I chop wood. So if you want to get better at crafting, then do some crafting. It feels pretty natural. I just hope they re-examine the amount of time required for a few things. Finally, I'll cover currency. Now, this is tweaked a lot from test to test. Currently, silver is used for nearly everything as kind of like your base, just like money in the game. There's also gold, which is the premium currency. Now, it can be traded in for silver. You can't just like go in and purchase and then equip loads of top-end gear, though, and just buy power like that. You need the appropriate skills to unlock that stuff, which can only be done via gameplay. From everything the devs have said, they seem pretty committed to not making a pay-to-win game. From what I can tell, purchasing gold and then transferring that into silver is quite a time saver, as you won't have to do as many silver runs, which are basically just dungeon runs with other players to get some silver coins. So it will cut down on the amount of time you need to maybe go get currency, but overall it's something that they definitely need to be very careful about. The devs have said that they are very much fans of the EVE Online model, and I think that could work really well because they're both sandbox-style games where nearly everything is crafted by the players, so that definitely can work. I just hope that they don't go and like do an Arcade and, mar a potentially great game by a free-to-play model, which really doesn't work out that well. Still, the game is decently early on in that it's still going through its testing period, so hopefully they will strike a good balance there. That's certainly one of the things that I am most interested to see, is whether they actually do that well. If they mess up the free-to-play model, it's probably not a game I would play, because I just don't like pay-to-win. But from what they've said, it doesn't seem like they will, and if that continues to be the case, then I can definitely see this being a second game that I play, because I've actually had a lot of fun. And just moving on to my actual feedback for the game, I really like the art style and the feel of the zones, and overall that stuff does pair to actually make quite a relaxing and therapeutic game, which is one of the reasons why I think I've mainly been enjoying it. It's just, I can chill out with it for a bit, which is nice. The music, though, is really generic, but it only plays in the, login screen, so that's probably not a big issue. I think the basic gathering and the crafting feels really rewarding, though I think some of the skill ups are perhaps a tad long to get. But overall, I think the core gameplay is there. Their guild versus guild stuff seems genuinely extremely interesting. I love the idea of that territorial gameplay, and I also like how if you're not into the PvP combat, you can do your dungeons, you can do your raids, and you can support your guild in its sort of PvP endeavors by crafting weapons for people, crafting armor, and being a part of the war machine. I think that's really cool. Though in terms of some things that I would like to see improved, I think the UI on PC does suffer from the game being multi-platform. It works just fine, but I think they really need to allow for more customization and the ability to kind of scale UI elements up and down, because they can get kind of large. Also, perhaps owing to them releasing on tablets, the right click doesn't really do anything. This does ensure parity across devices, but it makes the PC controls feel a little bit hamstrung. I get that they want balance, but I think they should definitely have some context stuff for the right click. I just think that would be really nice. There are also too many UI elements which involve holding down the mouse and hovering over things. That's a simple thing to fix up, and I'd imagine by launch a lot of these UI problems would be fixed, but just having a full, proper, customizable PC user interface would make a more enjoyable experience for me overall, so hopefully that's something they really do target. I also think it's quite hard to target particular enemies when you're in a really large group of people and everyone's fighting. I'm not sure how they'd fix that. Maybe they could just do some stuff with the context of what you're doing, but it's something that maybe they could look into doing a little bit more. Overall, though, I'm enjoying this game more than I thought I would, and since the game is going to be a free-to-play game, I recommend giving it a go when it comes out, especially if you are sort of a part of that whole, mid-2000s RuneScape hype. And it does seem like the free-to-play model is going to be a very decent one from what I can tell. I just hope they stay the course on that. Now, of course, go and take a look at gameplay and decide for yourself. This video is mainly an overview to let you know kind of what's going on, and, while I've got no editorial strings here, and I think I have been very frank about overall what I think, it's definitely important that you come to your own conclusion. So there you go, that's basically it for the video. Overall, this is a game that I see myself playing when it comes out. I think the core gameplay loop is really fun. I love the idea of the guild stuff. I think it's just relaxing and honestly a bit of a breath of fresh air, but hopefully this is, going to be an up-and-coming game that scratches that itch and advances the formula by having that guild versus guild stuff, and I think just having some, stuff in the world that actually matters, this is a town that is owned by a guild. It's not in an instance part of the world, it's like a thing in the world of Albion. It's real in a way, and I think having that meaningful stuff in the world, it could be really fun, really cool. I don't really have the time to play EVE Online, but what I've always loved is the idea of all that faction gameplay and those big wars between corporations. It sounds like this could be a way to get a similar vibe. So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, hope you found it useful, and yeah, I will see you in the next one.